In the small suburban town of Brighton Hills, nestled just outside of Phoenix, Arizona, 13-year-old Miles Jackson had a habit of daydreaming during class. His mind often wandered, drifting far from the confines of his 8th grade classroom at Central Middle School. The world outside, with its sprawling desert landscape and vibrant sunset hues, seemed far more intriguing than the repetitive lessons inside. On this particular day, the classroom buzzed with the familiar hum of student chatter and the scrape of chairs against the floor. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long, golden rays across the room's pale tile floor. It was mid-September, and the Arizona heat still clung to the air, though a hint of autumn was starting to make its presence felt. The windows of room 202 were slightly ajar, allowing the faintest whisper of a breeze to make its way through. As the bell rang, signaling the start of the school day, Miles shuffled into the room, his worn sneakers brushing lightly against the floor. He had become a fixture of the class's quietest corner, a space near the back by the window, where he could look out at the desert landscape that stretched endlessly beyond the school grounds. With his backpack slung loosely over one shoulder, Miles sank into his usual seat, the one farthest from the teacher's desk, and quietly unpacked his materials. He wasn't one to stand out or call attention to himself. His classmates often joked about his mysterious aura, but had mostly left him to his own devices, which was exactly how he liked it. His brown eyes, sharp but distant, took in the scene before him, though his mind was elsewhere. Today, it was on the cloudless sky and the distant mountains that seemed to shimmer on the horizon. The school day unfolded around him, but it was the mathematics class that held no real allure for Miles. Unlike his classmates, who struggled to keep up with the lessons, Miles found himself bored by the slow pace of the curriculum. He had always been quick with numbers, faster than his peers, and the constant repetition of basic arithmetic made him restless. Instead of engaging with the material, he let his thoughts wander, scribbling down complicated equations and abstract problems in the margins of his notebook. It was his way of escaping, of challenging himself when the lesson seemed too easy. But not everyone in the room was oblivious to his behavior. Mrs. Lillian Garcia, the math teacher, had noticed Miles's lack of engagement in class. A seasoned educator in her mid-40s, Mrs. Garcia had a reputation for being strict but fair. Her commanding presence in the classroom came from her experience, and her ability to spot potential in her students was second to none. It didn't take long for her to notice Miles's quiet brilliance, and it frustrated her. She had seen it time and time again. The students who had the talent but lacked the motivation to apply themselves. It bothered her that Miles, with his clear aptitude for mathematics, didn't seem to care about showing it. Today, Mrs. Garcia was particularly irritable. She had spent hours grading the latest math tests, and the results had been underwhelming. A handful of students had performed well, but the majority of the class had floundered. Most of the students didn't take the subject seriously, and the fact that Miles had yet again aced his test without even trying made her question why he refused to engage. Mrs. Garcia decided it was time to do something about it. The test papers, each marked with a red score, lay neatly stacked on her desk. As she began handing them back, she called out students one by one. Some were relieved to see decent grades, while others cringed at the low scores they had earned. When it was Miles's turn, she paused for a moment, looking down at his test paper, which had a large red 100% circled at the top. It wasn't the first time Miles had aced a test, but it was the first time she felt the weight of his potential pressing on her. She handed him his test without a word, her eyes narrowing as she returned to the front of the room. "All right, class, let's settle down." Mrs. Garcia's voice cut through the low murmur of students talking. "Some of you did all right on the test, but many of you are still struggling with basic algebra. This is the foundation for everything else. And if you don't get it now, you're going to have a tough time in the future." Her tone was sharp, and Miles didn't miss the slight irritation in her voice. Miles, however, wasn't listening. His attention had already drifted back to the window. The rustling of leaves outside caught his ear, and his mind wandered once more. His classmates, though, were listening intently, watching as Mrs. Garcia continued her critique. "You all need to understand algebra," she said, her voice rising slightly. "It's not just a class requirement. It's a life skill. You need this to succeed in high school, college, and beyond." For some, she paused, looking directly at Miles. His distant expression did not go unnoticed. "Miles," she snapped, her voice breaking through the silence of the room. Miles jumped, his hand jerking away from his chin as the room's attention shifted to him. His heart began to race, and his face flushed with embarrassment. He quickly straightened in his seat. "Yes, Mrs. Garcia," he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "You seem really interested in what's going on outside," she said, nodding toward the window. "Care to share what's so fascinating?" Miles opened his mouth to respond, but quickly closed it again. He couldn't quite find the words. The class broke into a few muffled laughs, and Mrs. Garcia, not amused, turned the conversation into a challenge. "Let's see if you've been paying attention," she said, her tone firm. "Come up here, Miles. Let's see what you know." The class fell silent as Miles stood slowly. The familiar sound of this chair scraping against the floor seemed loud in the stillness. His classmates watched him, some with amusement, others with skepticism. They muttered under their breaths, a few wondering what he could possibly know. Miles felt the weight of their eyes on him, and the distance to the front of the room felt impossibly long. Mrs. Garcia stood beside the whiteboard, marker in hand, a calculating expression on her face. She wrote an equation, complex, advanced, and far beyond the level of the class's curriculum. It was meant to test him, to see if he could handle something more challenging. "Go ahead," she said, her tone almost mocking. "Show us what you've got." Miles hesitated for a moment. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounding in his chest. The whispers from behind him only made the pressure worse. He glanced at the equation. It was tangled. Exponents, fractions, and variables all mixed together. But then, something inside him clicked. This wasn't about his classmates or Mrs. Garcia. This was about him, about what he knew and could prove. Taking a deep breath, he gripped the marker and walked toward the board. The marker felt cold in Miles's hand, the plastic smooth, yet unfamiliar under the pressure of his grip. His heart was racing, but his mind was already in motion, analyzing the equation before him. It wasn't the kind of problem that most students would even attempt, but it was exactly the kind of challenge that Miles had secretly craved. For a moment, the classroom fell into a heavy silence. His classmates, once whispering and snickering, were now completely still, their eyes fixed on him with a mixture of disbelief and anticipation. Mrs. Garcia stood off to the side, her arms crossed tightly as she watched him closely. Miles could feel their eyes boring into him. He could hear the soft murmurs behind him as his classmates speculated on whether he would crumble under the pressure. "No way he's getting that," one of the students whispered. "He doesn't even know where to start." Another one chuckled. Their words were a dull hum in his ears, but they didn't faze him. His focus was elsewhere, on the equation. He took a deep breath and began. The first few strokes of the marker were tentative, cautious, as if he were testing the waters. But soon, his hand grew more confident, the marker gliding smoothly against the board. The complex problem began to unfold before him, each piece falling into place like a puzzle. His mind was moving quickly, breaking down the problem into simpler parts, isolating the variables, simplifying the fractions, eliminating unnecessary steps. He didn't even need to think about it much. It all made sense. As Miles wrote, the murmurs behind him grew louder. His classmates, who had expected him to falter, were now on the edge of their seats. "Wait a minute, he's actually doing it," one of the girls whispered. "He's solving it," another one said, her voice filled with awe. The whispers turned into hushed gasps as the equation on the board slowly began to take shape, each line leading to the next with precision and clarity. Mrs. Garcia, standing by the desk, felt a flicker of surprise. She had expected him to struggle, to at least hesitate. But Miles was making it look easy. She had always been frustrated by his aloofness in class, his refusal to participate despite his obvious talent. But now, as she watched him, she realized that perhaps she had misjudged him. Miles wasn't disinterested. He was just different. He didn't need to conform to the way things were usually done in the classroom. He had a way of thinking that was unique, and today she was seeing it for the first time. The room fell into a stillness that was almost surreal. The only sound was the squeak of the marker on the board as Miles worked, his hand moving faster now, his mind processing each step as if it were second nature. The equation that had seemed so complicated at first was now nothing more than a series of logical steps. For the first time that day, the class was completely silent, their attention fixed on the boy at the front of the room. Miles felt the weight of the room's gaze, but he didn't let it distract him. He could feel their disbelief, their awe, and for the first time, it didn't make him shrink back. Instead, it fueled him, pushing him to move faster, to complete the problem with the same precision he'd always used in the quiet solitude of his notebook. His hand finished the last few lines, carefully circling the final answer. The moment he stepped back from the board, the classroom was still. It was as if time had frozen for a moment, and all that could be heard was the soft hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. The answer stood there, neat and clear, with every step of the process clearly laid out. Mrs. Garcia walked slowly toward the board, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She studied the equation, her eyes moving over each line that Miles had written. Her brow furrowed for a moment as she checked his work, but she didn't find any mistakes. She couldn't find any mistakes. When she finally turned to face the class, her expression was a mixture of surprise and something else. Respect? Well, she said, her voice quiet, but carrying across the room. This is correct. The words were simple, but they held weight. The room was silent for a moment before a few tentative claps began. Soon, the applause grew louder, filling the space with an energy that had not been there just moments before. Miles stood there, feeling the heat rise in his cheeks. He didn't know how to respond. The applause was a new experience for him, and part of him wanted to retreat back into the quiet, unnoticed version of himself. But another part of him, something deep inside, wanted to stand tall, to acknowledge this moment, to accept that he had done something extraordinary. As the clapping faded, Mrs. Garcia turned to the class. "What you saw here," she said, her voice firm, "isn't just about luck. This is what happens when you take the time to understand the material." Miles didn't just solve the problem. He dismantled it. He broke it down piece by piece and made it look easy. That's real understanding. Her words hung in the air. And for the first time, Miles didn't feel the need to hide. He stood a little taller, his shoulders less hunched than usual, his hands resting loosely at his sides. He wasn't just the quiet kid in the back of the room anymore. For the first time, people were seeing him for who he truly was. Someone with a gift, someone who could do more than just get by. After a moment of silence, Mrs. Garcia addressed the class again. "Now, I want you all to understand something," she continued, her voice softening. "What you saw today wasn't just about solving a math problem. It's about taking ownership of your potential." Miles didn't sit back and wait for the answer to come to him. He took it step by step, and he made it work. I want all of you to think about that the next time you feel stuck. Don't give up. Work through it. Break it down, and it will make sense. Miles shifted uncomfortably at his desk, still holding his notebook in his hands. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. The applause had faded, but the feeling of being seen, really seen, was still there. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was new, and it made him feel a little out of place. As the bell rang, signaling the end of class, the students began to file out, some still whispering about what they had just witnessed. A few of them stopped to pat him on the back or mutter a quick, "That was awesome." But it wasn't the whispers or the pats on the back that stuck with him. It was the look in Mrs. Garcia's eyes as she called him over after the class had emptied. "Miles," she began, her voice softer now, "I need to apologize." He blinked, unsure if he had heard her correctly. "An apology. I've been teaching for a long time," she continued, choosing her words carefully. "And I like to think I know my students. But with you, I misjudged you. I thought your quietness meant you weren't interested, that your lack of participation meant you didn't care. Clearly, I was wrong." Miles shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It's okay," he mumbled, not really sure how to respond. "No, it's not," Mrs. Garcia said firmly. "You have a gift, Miles, and I don't want you to hide it anymore. Do you realize how rare it is for someone your age to think the way you do? To be able to solve problems like that so easily?" Miles looked down at his notebook, his fingers tracing the edges of the worn cover. "I don't know," he said quietly. "I just like doing it. It makes sense to me." Mrs. Garcia's expression softened. "That's exactly what makes it special," she said. "You see things differently, and that's something to be proud of. But here's the thing. You can't keep it to yourself. There are programs, competitions, and even advanced courses that could help you grow, challenge you. I'd be happy to help you find them, if you're interested." Miles's heart raced at the thought of stepping into a world beyond the quiet comfort of his own learning. It was exciting, but also terrifying. Could he do more? Could he be more? "I don't know," he admitted. "What if I mess up?" Mrs. Garcia smiled. "Messing up is part of learning, Miles, but if you don't try, you'll never know what you're capable of. The days following that moment in Mrs. Garcia's classroom were a whirlwind for Miles. What had started as a quiet, uneventful day in room 202 had spiraled into something entirely different. His classmates, who had once ignored him or given him odd glances, were now looking at him in a new light. He was no longer just the quiet kid in the back row. He was the math wizard, the one who had made solving an impossible equation look easy. It wasn't just the applause that lingered in his mind. It was the way he had stood in front of that whiteboard and conquered something that had once seemed insurmountable. For the first time, he realized that he had something inside him that he hadn't even fully understood before. But with all the attention came a new weight. A pressure that Miles hadn't anticipated. The whispers in the hallways, the curious glances, and the sudden requests for help with math homework were all new to him. It was flattering, in a way, but also overwhelming. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He wasn't used to being seen. At lunch the next day, Miles sat alone, as he usually did, near the window of the cafeteria. He had always preferred to eat in silence, away from the clamor of his peers. Today, though, the buzz around him felt different. Students from different grades approached him with shy smiles, asking him how he had solved the equation the day before. It was strange. People who had never even acknowledged his existence now wanted to know what was going on in his mind. He answered them as best as he could, though he felt a bit out of place. A few students even asked if he could tutor them, offering to help with homework or projects in exchange. Miles appreciated the offers, but also felt the weight of responsibility that came with them. It wasn't just about his math skills anymore. It was about how others now saw him, and he wasn't sure if he was ready for that. He had spent so many years fading into the background, and now being in the spotlight was a challenge. Back in Mrs. Garcia's class, the dynamic had shifted as well. She no longer called on him with sharp tones or impatience. Instead, her approach was softer, more encouraging. She asked him to answer questions when she could tell he was ready, and when he did, it was with more confidence than he had ever had before. The moment he had solved that equation on the whiteboard had ignited something in him. A small spark of self-belief had taken root. It wasn't just about the math. It was about the realization that he was capable of more than he had ever imagined. For the first time, he felt like he could step forward, not just in math, but in life. One afternoon, Mrs. Garcia pulled him aside after class. "Miles, I've been thinking," she said, her voice warm but serious. "I know I offered you the opportunity to join the advanced math program, and I want to know if you're ready to take that next step." Miles shifted uncomfortably, his fingers toying with the strap of his backpack. He had thought about Mrs. Garcia's offer a lot in the past few days, but the idea of stepping into something more challenging was both exhilarating and terrifying. "I don't know," he said, his voice quiet. "What if I can't keep up? What if I mess up again?" Mrs. Garcia smiled, her eyes filled with understanding. "Messing up is part of learning, Miles. You can't grow if you're always playing it safe. But if you don't try, you'll never know what you're capable of." Miles hesitated, his mind racing. He thought about the math competitions, the advanced classes, the possibility of pushing his boundaries further than he had ever done before. It was all so new, so unfamiliar. But then he thought back to that moment on the whiteboard, the way everything had clicked into place as he solved that complex equation. It felt right. It felt like he was meant to do this, even if he didn't fully understand why yet. "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice stronger than it had been in days. "I'll join the program." Mrs. Garcia's smile widened, her eyes filled with pride. "I knew you would. You're going to do great. Miles, I'm here to help you every step of the way." The following week, Miles attended his first session of the advanced math program. The room was different from any classroom he had been in before. It was filled with students from various schools, each one eager to learn and to push their limits. The energy in the room was palpable, a mix of excitement and competition. Miles sat in the back, feeling both out of place and yet strangely at home. The problems were difficult, challenging in ways that he hadn't expected. But as he worked through each one, breaking them down piece by piece, he felt a sense of fulfillment he hadn't experienced before. For the first time, Miles felt surrounded by people who understood him, people who shared his passion for numbers, who were just as eager to dive into the complexities of mathematics as he was. It was exhilarating. He felt like he was finally in the right place, where he could grow and learn without having to hide. Back at Central Middle School, things were different too. His classmates no longer saw him as the quiet, invisible kid. They saw him as someone with talent, someone who could help them understand the things they had struggled with. They came to him for help with math problems, asking him to explain things that seemed impossible to them. It was strange at first, but Miles didn't mind. He was finally being seen for who he was. Someone who had something to offer, someone who was capable of more than just getting by. As the weeks passed, Miles grew more confident in his abilities. He no longer hesitated to speak up in class, to raise his hand when he knew the answer. Mrs. Garcia was supportive, offering him extra challenges and guiding him through more advanced concepts. She had seen the potential in him all along, and now it was starting to shine. At home, his parents noticed the change in him as well. One evening, after a long day of school and homework, Miles sat at the kitchen table, his notebook open in front of him as he worked on a particularly difficult problem for his advanced class. His mother walked in, placing a hand on his shoulder. "I'm so proud of you, Miles," she said, her voice full of love and admiration. "You've always had something special inside you, and now the world is starting to see it too." Miles looked up at her, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Mom," he said quietly, his heart swelling with pride. For the first time, he wasn't just solving problems for himself. He was solving problems for others too, helping his classmates, his friends, and maybe even making a difference in the world around him. As he glanced back down at his notebook, his pencil hovered above the page. This time, he wasn't afraid of what lay ahead. The future was full of possibilities, and he was ready to take the next step. In the weeks that followed, Miles continued to excel in both the advanced math program and his regular classes. His classmates looked up to him, and even Miss Garcia recognized the transformation in him. He had gone from the quiet, overlooked kid to the student who had the courage to embrace his potential. One day, as Miles walked into the classroom, he was greeted with nods, smiles, and even a few high fives. His classmates had come to respect him, not just for his intelligence, but for the way he had overcome his fear of standing out. For the first time, he felt like he belonged, and as he sat down at his desk, ready to face whatever challenges came next, he knew one thing for certain. He was no longer afraid to shine.